Alrighty, so today we're actually going to be finishing up the human body. We've gone through pretty much all the organ systems, and we're going to finish up with reproduction. So where do new babies come from? And then we're going to throw musculoskeletal systems at the end just because it doesn't really fit anywhere else. And honestly, it's kind of a short one. So like I said, the reproductive system, where do babies come from? And while I would love to sit here and talk to you all about baby raccoons, because look how cute those babies are, aren't they precious? Don't you just want to eat them? Instead, we're going to talk about humans, because, that's what we are. And so obviously genetic females and genetic males have very, very, very different reproductive systems, but there are some similarities. There are both kind of organs that hold the gametes. So if you remember, gametes are eggs and sperm. There are sex cells. In men, the organ that holds their gametes are called their testis. People call them testicles, balls, all of that. But they're technically, the organ is called the testis. In females, it's the ovaries. The ovaries hold your, what do you call it? Your eggs, your egg cells. And then you have a tube. For men, it's called the vas deferens. For females, it's the fallopian tubes, and that tube kind of takes your gametes to where it needs to go. And then they will leave your body. The females also have the uterus, which is what kind of where the eggs implant if you are pregnant. So today we're going to talk a lot about how pregnancy works, or not a lot, a little bit about kind of how pregnancy works, what's really going on there. And so we're not going to spend a ton of time on the male anatomy because most of the pregnancy stuff obviously happens in females. But I did just want to remind you that females cannot produce eggs throughout their life. You're born with about 750,000 eggs, and by the age of maturity, sexual maturity, so that's when you get your first period. For females, you have about 400,000 eggs, and that's how many eggs you have. You cannot make more. Whereas males can make 400 million sperm a day. So that causes a huge difference in just kind of the reproductive anatomy and how much energy goes to it. Because men are constantly producing sperm, whereas females only get so many eggs. And like I said, the male anatomy, your testes, like also, colloquially called the balls, they are away from your body. That's to keep this, your actual testes thermoregulated. Thermoregulation, which literally just means like temperature control. If they're too close to the body, then your sperm actually start to denature. That's why they hang down. But in certain temperatures, they might go up or down or things like that. That's all about thermoregulation. So keeping your testicles at the right temperature, or your testis at the right temperature, so that your sperm can be completely functional. And then you can see here your vas deferens kind of does this fun little all the way around thing. This gland right here, or sorry, not gland, organ, is called your prostate. And this is where people tend to get cancer and things like that. It kind of helps control some of it doesn't really control your sperm, but it kind of helps hold your sperm. And also just because, when people have to get a prostate exam, which you should start getting, I think it's around the age of 35. This is your rectum or your anus or your butthole or whatever you want to call it. And that's why you have to get a prostate exam that way, because you can actually stick your finger and if you're a trained medical professional, you can feel the prostate, and if it's enlarged, that can cause a lot of problems. And one of the things that can affect is your sperm count. And then your sperm goes down your urethra, just like your urine that we talked about last time. So for men, urine and sperm come out the same hole, out the urethra. And so men have two holes, a rectum and a urethra, and sperm comes out of that. So that's kind of the male reproductive anatomy. And like I said, they can make 400 million sperm a day. That happens completely in the testis. For females, it's a little bit different. First of all, your uterus. Your uterus is building up its lining every single month. So when people have their period, or what's technically called your menstrual cycle, what is happening is your uterus is building up its lining because it needs its lining in order for an egg to implant. And biologically, and again, I'm not sitting here, let me tell you, I have a baby. I have a 7-month-old who isn't sleeping, and it's very, very hard. And I love her with all my heart, but it is it is without a doubt the hardest thing I've ever done. So I am not sitting here trying to tell everybody to have a baby. No, 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 definitely not. But I'm just talking about from a biological standpoint, your body is all the time trying to make you have a baby. Your body's number one goal is babies. And so what happens is your uterus is building up its walls, what's called your endometrium, the lining of the uterus. It's building it up every month. And it's like, oh my gosh. So imagine it's like your uterus. It's like kind of like a grandma. And it's like, oh my gosh, you're going to come visit me. My grandchildren are going to come visit me. And so they're cleaning their house, or like an owner of a nice bed and breakfast. They're like, I'm going to clean it out. I'm going to fluff the pillows. I'm going to make it so, so nice. Oh, it's so great. I love it. This is going to be the cushiest, most wonderful place to stay. You're going to love it. It's the best 5-star resort ever. And then your egg does not implant. So once every, usually 28 days, depends on the person. There is some variation, but every 28 days, if your egg doesn't implant, then your uterus kind of has a emotional breakdown. It's like, oh, okay. I guess you're just not going to stay here. That's fine. And it literally tears apart its wall, tears apart the endometrium that just built up. It's been about 28 days building up, and it rips it to shreds. That's what causes the blood. What's bleeding out is the endometrium breaking apart. When people get endometriosis, which is a very, very painful, potentially deadly thing, what happens is their walls don't completely break apart, and they build and build and build, and it can cause a lot of issues with reproduction, and also just be really, really painful. So when you're bleeding, that's your walls breaking apart. And it's like, okay, fine. You don't want to stay here. You don't want to stay here. That's totally fine. I don't mind. I'm not upset at all. It's fine. And then after you finish bleeding, which for most people is 3 to 7 days, anywhere between, depends on how much lining you built up. The more lining, the more you're going to bleed. Then your uterus is like, I'll forgive you. Don't worry. I'll get over it. I'm going to start building up the walls again. I'll make it really nice for you. This time you'll stay. So it does this every 28 days. It's your cycle. It's called your menstrual cycle. The actual menstruation is when you're bleeding. Now, ovulation is really important, and we're going to talk about it in a few minutes. But ovulation is when your egg actually releases. Technically, this is when you can get pregnant, because you can only get pregnant when your egg is in your fallopian tubes. It's being released. When does this happen? About 5 days after you finish bleeding. There is some differences between people, and sometimes you kind of stop bleeding, but people have what you call spotting, where you're bleeding a little bit. So does that day one or not? It's kind of hard to gauge, but that is when you can get pregnant, and it usually only lasts like 3 to 4 days. So that's technically the time you can get pregnant, is when you're ovulating. Usually happens after, but technically you can ovulate all the time, and you can ovulate more than once a month. Some people do. It's rare, but it can happen. So when you bleed, you're not bleeding because of the egg. You're actually bleeding because of the uterine lining. Now, if this doesn't happen, if your egg does implant, what happens is, again, in the fallopian tube during ovulation, a sperm meets the egg. So if you're a sperm, what happens is you have to travel up the vagina. The vagina is technically the inside. The external female anatomy is called a vulva, but the vagina is right inside. It goes up the vagina, through the uterus, up the fallopian tube, and implants somewhere in the fallopian tubes. And remember, this part, whenever the egg is moving through the fallopian tubes, this is when we call ovulation. And so at some point in the fallopian tubes, the sperm can meet the egg and gets fertilized. Only one sperm can fertilize the egg. After that, then the egg kind of creates a shell, and it stops any other sperm from forming. If you have twins, usually it has nothing to do with 2 sperm. There are very, 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 very rare, I think there's like 10 maybe documented cases of 2 sperm fertilizing an egg, but that's normally not what happens. What happens with a twin is completely different. Sometimes it can be two eggs get fertilized at the same time, or the egg splits not weird. It splits at some point and you get two babies, but it's not two sperm. Only one sperm fertilizes the egg. Then the egg starts to immediately divide. And that is when you get pregnant. Then the what's called the blastocyst at this point, it's, you know, it's got a couple of cells, implants onto your uterine wall, all of that endometrium that your uterus is making. That's how it works. And then once it's implanted, it starts to develop. It develops at the cellular level for a while. And then it starts to grow. It looks like this little weird alien thing. Again, at one point you have a tail and that regresses. We say pregnancy is 9 months. It's technically 40 weeks. And a lot of times we focus on this outer development. Of course, the inner development's also happening. Your brain is developing, your lungs, all of your internal organs, your digestive system develops. You, as an infant, there's literally poop in the uterus that then gets filtered out through the umbilical cord. Remember, mammals are placental, which means that the placenta is actually what nourishes the baby, and that's why you have a belly button. That's where your placenta comes in and it goes out. So all of the nutrients from the mom goes through the placenta, through the umbilical cord into the baby, and all of the nutrients go out. Once the digestive system starts to develop within the fetus, then it, like, poop and stuff comes through that umbilical cord. All sorts of crazy things can happen. And when you deliver, the babies can poop on themselves. I found that out. My baby did that. Yeah, it's a whole thing. So this is growing inside your body for 40 weeks. And I'll tell you, here's a little gif of what that looks like. Yep. So as you can see, all of the organs get smushed about, and the bladder gets completely compressed. That's why pregnant women, like, kind of one of the classic funny things is that they always have to go to the bathroom. Look at this. Your bladder is gone. Of course, you always have to go to the bathroom. It also causes a lot of stomach pains. Gas is a huge thing and all of that. That's because your intestines and everything gets smushed about. A lot of this is completely controlled by hormones. So that endocrine system that I talked about, what's developing when, where, how is it working? A lot of that is hormones. And your hormones are changing all the time. Your milk tends to come in at the very end, and that's prolactin. And that's why pregnant women, also their breasts get bigger. Part of that's oxytocin and other hormones, but as they fill with milk, they literally enlarge. That's also why pregnant people get an outie. It's literally because their abdominal wall is pushed so much that if they have an innie normally, it becomes an outie because there's just no more room in there. This is why pregnancy is really uncomfortable. You can also see why it would cause a lot of back pain, because you have a lot of extra weight, but it's centralized to one spot. And this happens in 40 weeks. Typically, women are supposed to gain around 35 pounds is a good, healthy amount of weight to gain. Babies don't weigh that much, obviously. The average weight is like 7.5 pounds, unless you have a big baby. My baby was 8 pounds, 5 ounces. She was a big girl. But babies can get up to be like 11 pounds, and they're really big. Oh, it sounds horrible. But so the 35 pounds is also the placenta. The placenta is really heavy, and if you have a vaginal birth, you do have to deliver that afterwards. So the placenta will come out after the baby does, but it takes some time. It's not like immediate. But also you get a lot more blood, like, because your blood has to flow a lot more so that you can have nutrients to your baby. Also, like I said, your breasts get bigger, your lungs have to get a little bit bigger in order to be able to breathe. Pretty much everything changes. So 35 pounds is about how much a person's supposed to gain. A lot of people gain more because you're hungry all the time. But that's yeah, that's the miracle of birth. Now, if a baby is born before 37 weeks, so less than 37 weeks, it's considered premature. And then an actual medical term is if they're born before 26 weeks, it's what's called a micropreemie. Premature births can be really, really dangerous. It all depends on how quickly. The last 5 or 6 weeks, the baby is just growing, literally physical growth. That's why a lot of times if a baby's born premature, they have to go in what this contraption is called an incubator. It keeps them warm and it just allows them to grow. Depending on how early, though, things that happen at the end are also your heart develops. For micropreemie babies, their lungs haven't fused together. So their lungs, they can't breathe because their lungs haven't actually fused into that cardiovascular system that we've talked about. Because in the uterus, you don't want your baby to be breathing. But so the lungs don't fuse until pretty late. So premature babies depends a lot about like how well they survive, what happens, what they need. Depends on how premature they are. Micropreemies have a pretty bad survivorship rate just because they are so early. You can also unfortunately have miscarriages. That's when your baby or your fetus doesn't develop. Usually miscarriages are a lot more common within the first trimester. But they can happen at any point. So your body has evolved to be able to do this and have a baby and carry it for 37 or 40 weeks, but things can happen. Premature births can happen for a million different reasons. So can miscarriages. You can't contribute it to one factor. There are literally millions. And so 40 weeks is good if you have problems. I was having some organ failure when I was pregnant. And the big thing they tried to do is keep your baby in for 37 weeks. Because after 37 weeks, they're not premature. And after that, babies tend to have not a lot of problems. So if you're like a week or two early, people can also be a week or two late. Part of that's because of when we estimate the beginning of when the baby started to develop. But part of that can also be other things as well. Like some babies will stay in for 41 weeks. So that's how babies kind of develop a little bit, very briefly, obviously. But sometimes people are like, that doesn't sound good. I don't want to get all my organs smushed. So there are ways to stop or prevent pregnancy. One of them is this contraption. It's called an IUD, which stands for intrauterine device. And so this is something that females have implanted into them, and it goes inside their uterus. Oops. So through the cervix, which is the bottom of the uterus, it goes inside and gets implanted there. Happens a couple of things. It literally causes a physical barrier. So remember, sperm have to go into the fallopian tubes, but here the IUD can actually stop it. It also creates a really, really thick mucus right here at the cervix. And sperm have a hard time going through that very thick mucus. It makes your endometrial lining really, really thin. So egg cannot implant on it, because if it's so thin that even if it does get fertilized, it cannot implant. So it does quite a few things. An IUD is really painful to get implanted, because in order to get implanted, you have to open up your cervix, which is normally closed, and having that open up is pretty painful. It lasts a couple of days. It's not like it's painful for months. Once it's in, for the most part, people can't feel it. There is a string that you cannot see, but one thing that can happen with an IUD is they can get pulled out, which is from reports very, very painful. Also, if they're not implanted correctly, they can fall out as well. And then obviously they're not effective. IUDs tend to last 5 to 10 years, depending on exactly which one it is. But so you can get it implanted and then not get pregnant for like 10 years. At any point they can get removed though, but for the most part, doctors try to not, like, if you're like, I don't want to get pregnant for like, a few months, or I don't know, maybe I'll get pregnant, but I'm just kind of waiting. IUDs, they're pretty much like, if you are pretty sure you don't want to get pregnant for a good amount of time, because it is painful and a lot harder to get put in. There's also hormonal control. So this is what we consider like the pill. The birth control pill is hormones. There's also Nexplanon, which is a implant that goes right here in your arm, in your forearm. Both of those release hormone. What hormone is released and at what level is really dependent on what pill you're using. Some pills release different levels of hormones. The lower the hormone, the less effects you have. Birth control can cause a lot of effects, like weight gain is really common. It also can make you have a lot lighter periods, because one of the things that birth control does is, again, it makes that endometrial lining a lot smaller. That's why sometimes people get put on birth control pills that have nothing to do with pregnancy, just like they have really bad periods, or your periods are really irregular. It makes them more regular. But this is all about the pill, and the Nexplanon implant affect your hormones. And so, like I said, it can do a couple of things. For the most part, it, again, makes your mucus, cervical mucus, which makes sperm hard to go through. It makes you not ovulate until you, for like a certain amount of time, and then you get off the pill. Usually you take the pill for 3 weeks, the 4th week you're off of it, and that's when you ovulate. So because you can't get pregnant unless you're ovulating. And it also thins that uterine lining. So again, even if it does get fertilized, it can't implant. So birth control pills are the most common way. As of right now, female birth control pills are really common. What about male birth control pills? Not so common. There are in development though, so that males can also take birth control. And what it would do is lower sperm count, or make sperm not work, or pretty much like make somebody shoot blanks, if you will. So they would suppress sperm development, so that even if you could have sex, that you aren't producing sperm, so you can't get pregnant without sperm. There's a couple of ways they're trying to do this. They are in development, they're even in clinical testing, but this has not become popular or really popular. Like you can't like buy it at like CVS or get a prescription for it. Birth control pills do have to have a prescription. You can't just go to the doctor and buy them. And like I said, there are other ways. So like things like condoms and stuff are also birth control, in case you don't want to. You may have seen this. Remember, we did this on Valentine's Day, but I think it bears repeating. There are lots of other methods people use. The calendar method relies on that ovulation, but like I said, people ovulate different times and for different lengths of periods. So that's only about 70% effective. You can also have spermicide. Usually that's in a lubricant, and what that does is it's supposed to kill sperm, or the withdrawal period. That's kind of colloquially called pulling out. So when you try to stop sex before male ejaculation, so that then there's no sperm in, but there is something where sperm are released before the ejaculation, and so all of those are only about 70 to 76% effective. So not 100%, not even close. So not the best. Things like condoms, you can have a male or a female condom. Male condom goes on the penis, female condom goes in the vagina. A diaphragm is another thing. It goes in a female, so does a sponge, and a lot of times those have spermicide on them. Those are about 80% effective. And that's because if you read the back of a condom label, it'll be like 97% effective, but in actuality, people don't know how to put them on correctly, and that's why they're not as effective. Birth control pill, the patch, which is like a smoking patch, it's like a sticker that you can put on. You can put a ring inside you, or a shot. Again, all of those are for females to use, and those are between 92 and 97% effective. The pill is not as effective as advertised because people forget to take it. And the other ones are more, but if you literally miss one day, you can get pregnant. And then the highest 99% effective IUDs, because you can't forget. As long as it's implanted correctly, you're good. Well, you're 99%. The only way to 100% not have kids is abstinence. But if you're not going to be abstinent, these are other things. The implant, so that's again the next put-on one that you can get put in your arm. That is also really effective because you can't forget to take it, and it's just sitting in your arm. And then surgical sterilization. This is getting your tubes tied. They don't actually tie it. That has to do with your fallopian tubes. They disconnect them. Or your when men get a vasectomy, they disconnect that vas deferens, so the sperm can't travel. Males with a vasectomy can still produce ejaculate, but there's no sperm in it. Technically, both surgical sterilization, so a vasectomy or getting your tubes tied, can reverse themselves. It's rare, but it can happen, which is why they're not 100% effective. The only thing that's 100% effective is abstinence. Also, they are reversible, especially if vasectomy is reversible, but it's pretty hard, and it does lower the chance of reproducing. So it's not something like, if you're like, I don't think I want to have kids, usually that's why doctors are hesitant to do it on younger people, but that is stopping, and people are being able to get those more easily. Same with your getting your tubes tied. So that's birth control. Again, condoms are only 80% effective, and that's the most common form of birth control. So doubling up is a really good way to make sure that somebody doesn't get pregnant. So if you don't want to, pills and condoms are great. And condoms are the only thing that prevent an STI. So a sexually transmitted infection, things like gonorrhea, HPV, herpes, AIDS, because with a condom, there's no actual exchange of fluids. So that's also really good, especially if you don't necessarily know your partner. So that's reproduction, or what we're going to talk about with reproduction. And then the last organ system we're going to talk about for the human body is the musculoskeletal system. Like I said, this one's kind of short, but this is your bones and your skeletal muscles. So your bone anatomy, we've talked about bone marrow, and that's what runs through the middle. And remember, bone marrow is where blood cells are made. And then your bone actually has a couple of different parts. You have compact bone, and that is the really hard outer layer. And then in the bone, you have what's called spongy bone. So your entire bone isn't completely solid and hard. That would make you weigh so much that it would be impractical for your body to move, because it would just be so heavy. So in the middle of your bone, there's spongy bone. It's still pretty dense, but it's not near as strong as the compact bone. So usually when you get a break, if you break the compact bone, the spongy bone breaks really easy too. I think it's a lot easier, but the compact bone's hard, and it's harder to break. The larger the bone, the harder it is to break. Your femur is your like your leg bone, your what do you call it? Thigh bone. It's one long bone. It's very, very hard to break, but something like your clavicle, which is right here, your collarbone's pretty easy to break. And you also have blood vessels throughout your bones, which I don't know, that makes sense because bones are cells, and your cells need to be in contact with blood because they all do the metabolic things. But honestly, like when I first thought about that, I was like, oh yeah, there do have to be blood vessels. I don't know, it blew my mind. And I said, all of your blood cells are made in your bone marrow. And whenever you have two bones meeting, it's called a joint. And you have three types of joints. You have a fixed joint, which is in your brain. Your brain is actually your cranium, not your brain, your cranium, that's your skull, is made up of many different bones. When you're an infant, those bones aren't fused yet. Part of that so they can actually go through the birth canal, because the birth canal is small, and in order for a baby's head to fit, their brain or their skull can't be completely formed. That's also why babies that are delivered vaginally tend to have what people call a cone head. It goes away, but part of that's so it can literally fit through the female. But as an adult, those are completely fixed. So there's bone meeting, but they don't move. Your other joints have a hinge joint. So that's where they can kind of move 180 degrees. So think about your elbow or your knee or your fingers. So they can move about 180 degrees versus a ball and socket joint, which is in your shoulder and your hip. And that can move 360 degrees. So where depending on exactly the mobility depends on what type of joint you have. And that's for humans. We pretty much have our shoulders and our hips are our ball and socket joints. Most other joints are hinge joints. And for humans, adults have 206 bones. Phalanges are your fingers and toes. If you watch Friends, those are the most common bone because you have a bunch of bones in your fingers. Your carpals are your wrists. Your metacarpals are your hand. Babies actually have 300 bones. If you've ever heard like babies are squishy or babies are bouncy, that's because babies' bones aren't as developed. They literally have multiple bones in places that fuse together into one. Part of it is your skull, like I just talked about. And part of that's just so babies can fit through the female, but it's also just because like if you've ever seen a baby walk, they fall all the time and they get hurt. So they're a lot more durable. I mean, I'm not saying like throw one off a building or anything crazy like that, but you know, babies can fall down and a lot of times they're good. And part of that's because of these bones. They have more bones that haven't fused. That's also why it's pretty hard for babies to break bones, which evolutionarily makes sense. You don't want your young to break a lot of bones. We're not going to go through each one of these because, you know, but here's a list just in case you are interested in. One thing I do think is worth talking about is your vertebrae. This is where a lot of people have problems, especially older people as you age, not older, like, you know, in your 30s, which is still really fun and young. But you have technically 4 types of vertebrae, really 3. You have your cervical vertebrae, which is in your neck. You have 7 neck bones. That's the same number as giraffes. Giraffes have 7 neck bones too. Their neck bones are just a lot bigger than yours. But cervical vertebrae are in your neck. Your thoracic vertebrae are what have ribs on them. So, you know, kind of your midsection. And your lumbar vertebrae are your lower back. There's 5 of those. Then humans, their last vertebrae, what used to make up your tail, are all fused. That's called your sacrum. It's part of kind of like the back part of your pelvis, which is your hips. So these are your vertebrae. A lot of the most common issues with vertebrae are lumbar problems, so lower back problems. Part of this is because of posture. So technically, you know, we're supposed to sit up straight. And that actually, one of the reasons why that's important is because of the weight distribution of your weight, the distribution of weight throughout your back. If you slump over a lot, you're putting a lot more weight on your lower back. And so that is much worse for your vertebrae. Also, book bags or purses are terrible for your lower back because they put anything that you're carrying on your shoulders actually puts weight on your lower back. So lumbar problems are really common. When people talk about slipping discs or things, that's the cartilage that occurs between your vertebrae. If that gets messed up or worn down, it's very, very painful. But these are your backbones. And then muscles, humans have about 600 skeletal muscles. Remember, your organs and all of those are also muscles, but we're talking about skeletal muscles specifically. And these are commonly paired. So like your quadriceps and your hamstring. So quads are on the front of your legs, your hammies are on the back. Your biceps is the front of your arm, your triceps is the back. Your abs, your back, your actual back muscles, your neck, all of these things. The whole point of skeletal muscles are to move your bones. And these are the things that when you go work out that you can make bigger or smaller depending on working out. It is true that when you're like growing muscles, it's literally tearing and repairing, which is why things like protein powder can help because muscles are a lot of protein, but some of it's kind of complete crap. You should really do your research before you take that. But yeah, you got 600 muscles, and they grow and change throughout your body, throughout your life. So that is kind of the end of the human body.